Hi everyone, it's Jerry. The 14th and final round is the one that it took to determine the 2013 World Chess Championship candidate. In this video, I will show you both games between Magnus Carlsen, who's playing the white side, versus Peter Svidler, and in the second one, Vassily Ivanchuk versus Vladimir Kramnik, and I will really, for the most part, just be showing the moves. So let's see what it took in order to declare a candidate for the World Chess Championship against Anand, which will be taking place, by the way, later in 2013, around October and November. So we had in this game Carlsen playing the Roy Lopez versus Svidler, an opening that they had played in their first encounter earlier in this tournament, where the colors were reversed. Carlsen in that game ended up beating Svidler after the position opened up, but not a lot of captures just yet. And now a4, we see that the a file has been peeled open. This knight is repositioning to this e6 square, and there's some interesting similarities that we noticed when I was live streaming, having both games showing on the screen side by side. There was a lot of attention focused on this f4 and f5 square in both games. And in fact, we eventually get to a position where both the knights were positioned in the same way in both games. So this is how it's developing. We have the bishop bearing down against the king side, the bishop trying to get working in some way, and d5 is certainly the one break both sides have to look into, and we see that being prepped for the structural changes with the rooks getting to these currently closed files, but it is, again, in anticipation of the position opening up. f4, it's a big deal, and now a lot of time was really invested in. These times, by the way, are not accurate, so pay no attention to them. g3 is a very committal move, weakening this diagonal. The knight's being kicked now from f5, and it's very dangerous looking, this knight jumping into g5, the queen recapturing, and now after d5, opening up of the position, we have now knight g4, and at first glance it seems like the queen could capture it, but that's not the case. That would be dropping the bishop, and should bishop takes bishop happen first, we could be having the queen recapture, and she would be there to defend the knight laterally. So we don't have that. Instead, it's bishop f3, putting pressure on the knight, and white has to be very careful and bear in mind that at this stage in the game, Carlsen was already very low on time, needing to meet that first time control, namely getting those first 40 moves in within 2 hours. He was very low on time at this point, playing first bishop f6, a very direct move. Of course, it's giving check, and if it's taken, that would allow first queen h6 with knight recapture to follow. Black would be dead in a blink. We don't have that. Instead, it was the immediate king g6. The knight hops into h6, and it's very direct. The king only has one choice, of course. We now have queen to e3, trying to kick this bishop from f3. The bishop does go elsewhere, and now we have bishop h4, which is a curious move to see, just dropping the bishop back. But again, time trouble, it was a big deal. I think, to be a bit more exact, we were looking at Carlsen having about 3 minutes and still needing to make about, these next 10 moves. So bishop h4 was one of them, and I had wondered why not take this pawn on c5. I think we would be having the immediate block on d6. We didn't have that, though. Instead, it was doing moves that came instinctually. Bishop dropping back to h4. The queen now coming down to h3. This g3 move was highly committal, and it's now being highlighted with the queen and bishop converging on g2. That's defended with f3. The knight is now jumping in, and this is really the move that had to shock Carlsen. Being down on time, this is a move you do not want to see on the board, having to now calculate this knight very deep in your position. You played that g3 move earlier, and still the knight finds a way to make use of that square, threatening mate yet again on g2. He can't be tolerated, and in fact he is captured in the game. The queen recaptures, and now we have knight takes f7. The queen was hitting both knight and pawn. The knight is there, the bishop is there to defend. The bishop now comes down, exploiting the fact that the queen is overloaded. She can't watch both the f3 and e1 square. Queen to f2, very natural moves, kind of moves you would see in time pressure, and that's the case Carlsen was in, and I think less than even 30 seconds at this point. A lot of exchanges take place. The queens come off the board, and after the smoke clears, what do we have? We have a completely lost endgame, and as good as Carlsen is, it is not going to be savable. So time control is met at this point right here. Move 40, knight h6. This is the 40th move by Carlsen. Svidler had, I think, about 10-15 minutes. The bishop runs away, and this is completely busted. The king gets a little bit towards the center, but there's nothing to do about this pawn just inching closer, and black creating connected pass pawns, and with the aid of these two bishops, there's absolutely no resistance. h3 was played. The bishop was eyeing it up. First, bishop f4 kicks the knight to f7. Where does the knight even go? The bishop's boxing it out. Everything's hanging together by a thread. The bishop's there to defend the knight, but what is he really doing? Not a position to really be in. So here comes g5. Nothing really to do. The king comes here threatening the bishop, but Svidler has calculated it out. It's okay to allow the white king to grab the bishop. Black presses forward with g4. Couple exchanges. The king grabs the bishop. The pawn marches. The king tries to hunt it down, but after king f2, the bishop is there, of course, in time to play to h2 and facilitate the advancing of g1 equals queen. And it is at this point, after the 40th move by Peter Svidler, that Carlsen resigned. And as soon as that happened, the attention immediately turns towards that remaining game, namely the game between Vassily Ivanchuk and Vladimir Kramnik. So we'll have a look at that game right now. Okay, we have the game kicking off with d4, the perk being employed by Kramnik, and to be a bit more exact, we have the classical system, two-knight system, bishop e2 line. Both sides castled a6 to facilitate b5, grabbing some queenside space, h3 ruling out any pin, any removal of this knight, which would be a key defender of the dark squares. Typical idea is for black to strike at the d4 pawn with either c5 or e5. With knight c6 played, e5 is the only one pawn break that is really coming to mind. But we don't have that just yet. Instead, first bishop g5. b5 first. If h6, the bishop comes back to e3 first, and eventually there's a tempo-gaining queen d2 type of move. We'll see something very closely related to that. After b5, it's just a3, and I think throughout portions of this game I can recall how quickly certain responses were in the game. This was one of them. After b5 was played, a3 was rattled right off, and there were, of course, some cases where Ivanchuk went into a deep think. Again, the times that you're seeing on the clock, they are just not accurate. But anyhow, following up, after a3, h6, finally a question was thrown to the bishop. It runs back. And now e5, to be expected. There's not going to be the c5 advance. e5, you have to challenge this structure in some way. e5 is it. We do have them exchanged. And now, with the tension between the queens, it's avoided. Queen c1. Queen d2 is what I referenced earlier, pinpointing h6. There is a tempo there. The queen gets out of the way, and now rook to d1 is made available. However, first we have bishop c5. Reason for this? Well, if you do bishop to d1 right away, the queen can make use of e7. We don't have that. First is bishop c5, making sure that there won't be queen e7 after the rook plays to d1. The rook plays to e8, and I think actually a slight improvement is to play to g8, and maybe after this rook d1 move, the queen could make use of the e8 square. But now, black is having to work themselves into a pin, so it's a bit tricky. From here, b4 is played to cement this pawn from advancing. White would like to play in a4. Doing a4 right away is met with b4. So white is looking to bite at the b5 point and get some play along the b file. Queen c8 gets out of the pin, and already there starts to be some concern about the h3 pawn, both bishop and queen bearing right down on that. Queen e3, a very nice centralization of the queen, lateral defense as well on the third rank. If the bishop is ever capturing the pawn and then the queen coming down, that's tactically flawed. Knight g5 would be available with check, and the queen is gone. So the knight regroups, and this is what I was saying in the first game. We saw this by Peter Svidler. The queen knight making use of c6, d8, and eventually e6. Interesting similarity in both of those games that were happening right at the same time. But from here, b takes a, the a file opens up, the knight jumps into e6, the bishop repositions, and now another case. So we did see this. This is the position I was talking about. Both knights were on these same two squares in both games, e6 and h5, both eyeing that f4 square. Knight c3 getting it back into play, more central. Knight f4, and immediately there has to be, if you're playing the white side, some red flags going on the king side. What about sacrifices on g2 with a knight falling back into that f4 square with more pressure on these light squares? Fortunately, there just wasn't any good tactical sequence for black here. There is going to be enough defense. This knight is here. He's one defender. The queen is another one functioning laterally. She's not the best defender, but she's there to defend, and the bishop is not long off from contributing to some defense. And in the meantime, knight d5 centralizes itself, of course, and challenges that f4 square. And it's not easily kicked. c6 would just weaken b6. That'd be game over. So bishop b5, this was another case. After bishop b5, the bishop immediately, he just whipped off that bishop b3 move as a response, avoiding the light square bishop exchange, trying to say essentially that this bishop is much better than this one on b5. Much rather stay on this diagonal. So the bishop drops back to c6, and now we have an improvement with the rook doing a lot, functioning not only just on a file, but now laterally. Queen to b7, f3 kicks the knight, gives up this h3 pawn. This was all calculated, of course, and the main idea behind it is to give up a pawn in exchange for putting pressure on the black king. Without that pawn, now there is some pressure on the h-file. There was a threat of taking twice on g5. Black gets out of the pin. A couple of recaptures, and now f3 to reinforce the e4 point. It may be tempting to want to play to e7 with the fork to pick up the light square bishop, but you could be sure that knight here is met with rook takes, and if bishop recaptures, we're going to have bishop takes e, and that's bad news for white with the rook to fall soon enough. So instead, it's f3 reinforcing the central point e4. The bishop gets captured. After the recapture, c6 is forced in order to save the loss of material. It drops back to a very active post. Pressure on a6, pressure on f7. The pawn is pinned. The one on g6 is also unprotected from the current state of this bishop. The queen gets to a more active square, focusing on this diagonal. And in some sense, it's restricting this rook from contributing to more pressure on a6. Queen to b3, however, adding more pressure on that light square diagonal. h5. Bishop drops back. This knight is an annoying piece. You'd like to get rid of this so it would free up the rook to move. We do see that. The knight drops back to e6, which now permits the rook to leave from defense of the h3 square. So a lot of attention now focused on a6. h4 is played to weaken that f4 square. G takes h. Queen to d8. The queen is looking to sneak into h4, but now comes right back over. So, well, not just yet. We have first capture on a6 with a threat on a8. The rook reacts, defends c6, and now we have the rook come right back over on that h4 pawn. And from here we have rook c7, bishop takes, rook takes, and now b5. If you capture the pawn, this rook is going to get captured. The queen recaptures, and it's going to turn out very, very bad for black. We don't have that. Instead, it's rook b7, and now b6. Passed pawn, and it's a pawn plus. Right now we're working at 5 versus 4. This bishop is struggling to do something constructive, and now this pawn needs to be watched over. 2 steps away from queening. c5 is played. The rook, 3 heavy pieces are defending. Rook to b1 to defend. The bishop drops back to a more active square where it's at least watching over a pawn. The queen is now central. Black avoids the queen exchange, and now after rook to a1, looking to penetrate on that a8 square, we have rook d6, rook a8 still. queens come off, a couple in-between moves. There was the possibility for black to first insert this check move on d2, and by doing so you avoid white capturing on this square and creating a new passed pawn. That was not played. Instead it is rook takes b8, pawn takes rook, and now bishop to d6. A big question here is why not take the pawn on b6? Well, just following along with this, rook to a8 would be made available, and this pin is very difficult to get out of. In fact, I'm just not seeing a good solution to it. The problem with it is that white is now threatening to take on c5, attacking that pin piece, or even playing to h6 to attack that piece. Playing the king to g7 is not a good solution. Again, picturing the rook on a8, you grab the bishop, and after the king recaptures, bishop takes pawn, there would be a fork. Keep in mind this rook at that point would be on b6. That would be game over. And because of that rook's great activity, that's why we're not seeing rook takes b6. White would have the great reply, rook to a8. Or I should just say best reply. And from here, after bishop d6, trying to hold things together, we have rook a6, a more active way to defend the pawn on b6. One other thought would be to put that rook right behind the passed pawn and look to push it forward. But with this move, white also looks to advance this pawn and have a lateral attack against the bishop, and once you have that, maybe then the d6 pawn could start to get rolling. Rook to b7 puts a halt to that. That pawn can go no further. And after king to f1, Kramnik resigned. And what an exciting finish it was. It was really, really intense. I don't know, many of you might have been there while I was live streaming this. Very, very intense stuff. King to f1, this is a very, very clear plan. I was saying it just as it was played. King to f1, you could just start to see the king inch up as if he was a bishop. Moving up to e2, d3, c4, b5, c6. There's not a convenient way to be defending against that. White is up a clear pawn, and this pawn plus that white has is restricting the black side immensely. There's no good solution to the white king penetrating the black position, getting into that c6 square. I was saying during the stream, if the king is coming over, let's say to d7 to try and defend c6, that's maybe setting up for rook to a7 moves, creating more exchanges when you're the side that's headed in material that's going to benefit you. But actually looking a bit more direct, just the king coming up to c5 is threatening something simple, right? Bishop takes on c5. There's no good solution. This rook on b7 completely passive. White has the active pieces, has material, has everything else, and it's at that point that Kramnik threw in the towel. He resigned, and with that, Carlsen in round 14 lost. Kramnik in round 14, he lost, and because of that, they both ended up with 8.5 points in the tournament, and Carlsen wins out on tiebreaks as a result because he had more wins in the tournament than Kramnik. He had 5 wins, Kramnik only had 4, and well, that's that. Very, very exciting stuff. I'm very excited about it. I think it's going to be a really good thing for chess to have a young player now in the championship. He's going to be battling against Anand. This will be taking place later this year in 2013, around October or November. So I look to be covering all of those games definitely on this YouTube channel, youtube.com/ChessNetwork, and maybe even doing some live streams at twitch.tv/ChessNetwork like I did for this 14th and final round. I'm losing my voice at this point. If you are tuned in, if you're listening closely, I'm losing my voice. I've been doing a lot of talking, but it was worth it. I enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoyed it as well, and I look forward to doing the next video. I hope you're having a great day, and I think it's a good day for chess. That's all for now. Take care. Bye.